The Judge Judy courtroom fell into an eerie silence as Margaret Henderson, the iron-fisted president of Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, confidently strode to the plaintiff's podium clutching her infamous three-ring binder of neighborhood violations. Her perfectly pressed navy blazer and condescending smile radiated the kind of entitlement that had terrorized an entire community for over 15 years. She was here to collect $3,200 from a homeowner who dared to paint their mailbox the wrong shade of beige, and in her mind this was going to be the easiest victory of her legal career. But what Margaret didn't know was that Judge Judy Sheindlin had been waiting 25 years to face someone exactly like her, and this case would end with the most shocking property seizure in television history. Margaret thought she could waltz into America's toughest courtroom and intimidate Judge Judy the same way she'd bullied hundreds of homeowners in her suburban kingdom, armed with her covenant handbook and 15 years of unchallenged HOA tyranny. She was about to lecture the most feared judge on television about property law and community standards. She interrupted Judge Judy 6 times in the first 8 minutes, each interruption more arrogant and condescending than the last, treating the woman who'd presided over 12,000 cases like she was just another helpless homeowner at a monthly association meeting. But Judge Judy had spent 4 decades in the legal system destroying entitled bullies, and Margaret Henderson was about to become her most spectacular victim. What happened next would shock everyone in that courtroom and millions of viewers watching at home. When Margaret made her 7th attempt to silence Judge Judy, she crossed a line that no one had ever dared cross before. The words that came out of her mouth would trigger the most devastating legal counterattack in courtroom television history, one that would cost Margaret not just her lawsuit, but her house, her HOA presidency, her reputation, and her freedom. By the time Judge Judy finished with her, Margaret would be facing criminal charges, financial ruin, and the complete destruction of everything she'd built through years of neighborhood intimidation. The most powerful HOA president in her county's history was about to learn what real legal authority looked like, and it would be the most expensive lesson of her life. Before we dive into this incredible courtroom destruction, where an entitled Karen gets everything she deserves, smash that like button if you love seeing bullies get their comeuppance in the most devastating way possible. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell because you won't want to miss a single moment of courtroom drama where justice is served ice cold. Now let's witness how Judge Judy absolutely obliterated the most arrogant HOA tyrant ever to step foot in her courtroom, in a takedown so brutal it made legal history and changed the lives of an entire community forever. The case that appeared on Judge Judy's docket seemed routine enough. Margaret Henderson versus David Martinez, homeowner dispute over HOA violations, totaling $3,200 in fines and legal fees. But what the court paperwork didn't reveal was the 15-year reign of terror that Margaret had unleashed on the Willowbrook Heights community, turning a peaceful suburban neighborhood into her personal dictatorship. At 54 years old, Margaret had transformed from a concerned new homeowner into the most feared HOA president in the county, wielding a 47-page covenant document like a weapon of mass destruction against anyone who dared challenge her authority. Margaret's path to power had been methodical and ruthless. She'd moved into Willowbrook Heights in 2008 with dreams of creating the perfect community, but those dreams had quickly morphed into an obsession with control that would make dictators jealous. Within 2 years, she'd manipulated her way onto the HOA board, and by year 3 she'd orchestrated the removal of the previous president through a campaign of harassment and intimidation that left the entire board afraid to oppose her. Margaret had discovered that most homeowners would rather pay ridiculous fines than fight back, and she exploited this weakness with surgical precision. Her tactics were legendary in their pettiness and cruelty. Margaret would conduct surprise property inspections at 6 in the morning, measuring grass height with a ruler and photographing any violation she could manufacture. She'd fine elderly residents for having bird feeders that attracted pest animals, charge young families hundreds of dollars for children's chalk drawings on sidewalks, and levy massive penalties for holiday decorations that remained up 1 day past her arbitrary deadlines. The woman had actually fined a cancer patient $300 for having a medical transport vehicle parked in their driveway for more than 4 hours, claiming it violated the commercial vehicle restriction. But Margaret's true genius lay in her ability to exempt herself from every rule she enforced. While other residents received violation notices for minor infractions, Margaret's own property featured unpermitted deck additions, an unlicensed home business, and landscaping that violated multiple covenant restrictions. She'd created a separate set of rules for herself, justifying her hypocrisy by claiming that as HOA president, she needed flexibility to lead by example. The community had tried to challenge her authority multiple times, but Margaret had learned to weaponize the legal system, burying opponents in expensive litigation that most residents couldn't afford to fight. What Margaret didn't realize was that Judge Judy Scheindlin had built her entire career on people exactly like her. Over 4 decades in the legal system, Judge Judy had developed a sixth sense for detecting entitled bullies who used positions of minor authority to terrorize others. She'd presided over hundreds of HOA cases during her 25 years on television, and she could identify the patterns within minutes. The condescending tone, the manufactured outrage, the assumption that volume and aggression could substitute for actual legal authority. Judge Judy had grown up in Brooklyn watching her father stand up to neighborhood bullies, and she'd spent 25 years in New York family court dealing with the worst examples of human behavior: deadbeat parents who thought they could intimidate her, lying spouses who assumed she'd fall for their manipulation, and petty tyrants who believed their tiny kingdoms made them untouchable. She'd seen Margaret Henderson's type hundreds of times before, but she'd never encountered one quite this arrogant or quite this oblivious to the danger they were walking into. The defendant in this case, David Martinez, represented everything Margaret despised about the changing demographics of her precious community. A 32-year-old software engineer and first-time homeowner, David had committed the unforgivable sin of questioning Margaret's authority at a public HOA meeting. His violations were laughably petty. A mailbox painted desert sand instead of Sahara beige, garden gnomes that exceeded the covenant's unstated decoration limits, and a doormat with a humorous saying that Margaret deemed inappropriate for family viewing. But David had made the fatal mistake of asking to see the specific covenant language that justified these fines, triggering Margaret's nuclear response. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just Margaret's abuse of power, but the systematic corruption she'd built over 15 years of unchallenged authority. Judge Judy had no idea she was about to face the most entitled defendant in her television career, and Margaret had no clue she was walking into a legal buzzsaw that would destroy everything she'd spent decades building. The morning of the taping, Margaret Henderson arrived at the Judge Judy studio 2 hours early. Her war chest of documentation organized into color-coded sections that she'd spent weeks perfecting. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost an HOA case. Her designer briefcase containing what she believed was an airtight legal argument that would humble both the defendant and the television judge, who clearly didn't understand real property law. Margaret had done her research on Judge Judy's previous HOA cases and was convinced that most of the judge's victories came from dealing with unprepared defendants, not from any superior legal knowledge. The case file told a story of escalating neighborhood warfare that had consumed David Martinez's life for 8 months. It started when David had the audacity to question a $200 fine for his mailbox color at a monthly HOA meeting, asking Margaret to show him the specific covenant language that defined acceptable beige shades. Margaret had responded by launching what she called a comprehensive property audit, which resulted in 17 separate violations totaling over $3,000 in fines. The violations read like a comedy sketch: excessive garden gnomes defined as more than 2 decorative lawn ornaments, unauthorized doormat messaging that violated community decency standards, and a trash can placement violation for positioning bins 3 feet from the curb instead of the required 5 feet. But the crown jewel of Margaret's case was a violation she'd crafted specifically to destroy David's spirit: a noise ordinance citation for his children playing in their backyard after 6 p.m. on weekdays. Margaret had actually installed a decibel meter app on her phone and documented every instance of children's laughter that exceeded what she determined were acceptable community sound levels. She'd turned childhood joy into a legal weapon, charging David $50 for each documented incident of his 7-year-old daughter playing too loudly on their own property. When Judge Judy called the case, Margaret practically skipped to the plaintiff podium, her 3-ring binder held high like a trophy of bureaucratic warfare. She'd rehearsed her opening statement in the mirror for weeks, perfecting the tone of moral authority that had intimidated hundreds of homeowners into submission. Margaret began with her signature power move, the same opening that had crushed the spirit of every defendant she'd faced in local courts. Your Honor, as the duly elected president of a legally recognized homeowners association with fiduciary responsibility to protect property values and community standards, I'm here to enforce legally binding covenants that every homeowner willingly agreed to upon purchase. The words had barely left Margaret's mouth when Judge Judy's expression shifted from neutral interest to something far more dangerous. 25 years of television had taught Judge Judy to read people within seconds, and everything about Margaret's presentation screamed entitled bully. The condescending tone, the unnecessary legal jargon, the assumption that volume and authority could substitute for actual evidence. Judge Judy had seen this performance hundreds of times before, and she knew exactly where it was heading. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying that familiar edge that regular viewers recognized as a warning signal. Ma'am, before you continue with your speech about legal authority, let me ask you a simple question. What exactly makes a mailbox the wrong color in your community? It was a straightforward question that should have had a straightforward answer, but Margaret's response revealed everything Judge Judy needed to know about the person she was dealing with. Instead of simply citing a covenant provision, Margaret held up her hand to silence Judge Judy and continued with her prepared presentation. Your Honor, I need to establish the proper legal framework first. These aren't arbitrary rules. They're carefully crafted community standards that maintain property values and ensure neighborhood harmony. The defendant has shown a pattern of willful non-compliance that threatens the entire community structure. The courtroom fell silent as everyone processed what had just happened. Margaret Henderson had just interrupted Judge Judy Scheindlin in her own courtroom, treating America's most feared television judge like she was another helpless homeowner at an HOA meeting. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure that always preceded a Judge Judy explosion. Even David Martinez looked shocked at Margaret's audacity, suddenly realizing that his HOA president might be even more delusional than he'd thought. Judge Judy's eyebrows shot up as she processed the unprecedented disrespect she'd just witnessed. In 25 years of television and 40 years of legal practice, very few people had ever dared to interrupt her, and certainly not with such casual condescension. Margaret had just made the first of what would become 7 increasingly devastating mistakes, each one digging her grave deeper than she could possibly imagine. The woman who'd spent 15 years silencing her neighbors had just tried to silence the wrong person, and the consequences would be more severe than anything in Judge Judy's courtroom history. Margaret's first interruption had caught Judge Judy off guard, but her second interruption 30 seconds later revealed the true depth of her delusion. When Judge Judy tried to examine the actual covenant document that supposedly justified the mailbox violation, Margaret actually held up her hand like a traffic cop and declared, Your Honor, I need to explain the enforcement protocol first, because television judges often misunderstand how real HOA law works. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from surprise to genuinely uncomfortable, as everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in Judge Judy's 25-year television career. The third interruption came when Judge Judy attempted to ask David Martinez about his version of events. Margaret slammed her binder shut with a loud thud that echoed through the silent courtroom and announced, Objection, Your Honor. The defendant has already demonstrated a pattern of non-compliance and dishonesty. His testimony would be unreliable without proper context about HOA procedures. Judge Judy's face went through a series of expressions that regular viewers had never seen before. Confusion, disbelief, and something approaching genuine shock that anyone could be this brazenly disrespectful in her own courtroom. By the fourth interruption, Margaret had completely abandoned any pretense of courtroom decorum. She was now treating Judge Judy like she was a confused homeowner at a monthly association meeting who needed education about proper procedures. When Judge Judy tried to examine photographs of David's property, Margaret actually reached across and tried to organize them in her preferred order, saying, Your Honor, These need to be viewed in chronological sequence to understand the escalating violation pattern. Let me arrange them properly so you can see the evidence correctly. The fifth interruption marked the point where Margaret's confidence transformed into open condescension. She began lecturing Judge Judy about property law with the same patronizing tone she'd used on hundreds of homeowners. Your Honor, with respect, HOA governance is a very specialized area of law. I've been studying property covenants for 15 years, and most people, including judges who don't specialize in this area, don't understand the nuanced authority that homeowners associations possess under state law. Judge Judy's reaction to this fifth interruption was unlike anything viewers had ever witnessed. Her usual explosive anger was replaced by something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. She leaned back in her chair, steepled her fingers, and fixed Margaret with a stare that could have melted steel. The bailiff later told reporters that he'd worked with Judge Judy for over a decade and had never seen her this quietly enraged. The sixth interruption would prove to be Margaret's most catastrophic mistake yet. When Judge Judy finally attempted to deliver what should have been a devastating verbal assault on Margaret's behavior, Margaret made the unthinkable decision to cut her off mid-sentence. With her voice rising to a volume that dominated the entire courtroom, Margaret declared, "Your Honor, I'm going to have to stop you right there. I came here to get justice for my community, not to listen to a lecture about courtroom manners from someone who clearly doesn't understand the serious legal issues we're dealing with." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that courtroom understood they had just witnessed something that would make television history. Margaret Henderson had not only interrupted Judge Judy 6 times, but had just openly insulted her knowledge and authority on national television. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood for 15 years was about to learn what real legal authority looked like, and her 7th attempt to dominate the conversation would trigger the most devastating legal counterattack in courtroom television history. Margaret's 7th and a final interruption would go down as the most catastrophic mistake ever made on Judge Judy. As Judge Judy rose from her chair with the fury of someone who'd reached her absolute breaking point, preparing to deliver what would have been the most brutal verbal destruction in television history, Margaret made the unthinkable decision that would seal her fate forever. She slammed her hand on the podium so hard that her binder flew open, scattering papers across the floor, and screamed at the top of her lungs, "No, you listen to me. I deal with real legal authority every single day, not some fake TV judge who doesn't understand actual property law." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The cameraman stopped moving. The bailiff's hand moved toward his weapon. Even the court reporter stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keyboard in complete shock. Margaret had just called Judge Judy Scheindlin, a woman with 40 years of legal experience and 25 years presiding over 12,000 cases, a fake judge on national television. The insult hung in the air like a death sentence, and everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed the moment that would destroy Margaret Henderson's life completely and forever. If you're loving watching this entitled HOA Karen make the biggest mistake of her life, smash that like button and subscribe, because Judge Judy's response will be the most savage legal destruction you've ever witnessed. Comment below if you think Margaret deserves what's coming next, because what Judge Judy does in response will shock the entire world and make legal history. Judge Judy stood completely motionless for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. Her eyes locked on Margaret with a stare that could have shattered concrete. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet it was barely audible, yet somehow more terrifying than any scream. "What did you just call me?" Margaret, still drunk on her own arrogance, doubled down with the stupidity that would destroy her life. "I called you exactly what you are, a fake judge who needs to learn about real legal authority from someone who actually understands property law." Judge Judy's response was swift and brutal. "Ma'am, you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic little life. Bailiff, I want this woman's property records pulled immediately. If she wants to lecture me about real legal authority, let's see how well she follows her own rules." Within minutes, Judge Judy's staff had pulled Margaret's complete property history, and what they found was more damning than anyone could have imagined. Margaret Henderson The woman who'd spent 15 years terrorizing her neighbors over mailbox colors and garden gnomes, had been operating an unlicensed catering business from her kitchen, had built an unpermitted deck addition worth over $40,000 and owed more than $18,000 in her own HOA fines that she'd been secretly waiving for herself while collecting money from everyone else. Judge Judy read each violation aloud with surgical precision, watching Margaret's face transform from arrogant confidence to pure terror as her hypocrisy was exposed on national television. But the nuclear bombshell came when Judge Judy revealed that Margaret had been embezzling HOA funds to pay for her property improvements, while simultaneously fining residents for violations she was committing herself. The county records showed that Margaret had diverted over $60,000 in association fees into personal accounts, using the money to fund the very home improvements that violated the covenants she was enforcing against others. Judge, why? Judy's voice dripped with contempt as she declared, "Ma'am, you're not just a hypocrite, you're a criminal, and I'm ordering an immediate investigation into your financial records and property seizure to recover the stolen funds." Margaret's complete meltdown was spectacular and immediate. She began screaming about judicial overreach and conspiracy theories, claiming that Judge Judy was part of a television industry plot to destroy homeowners associations. The bailiff had to physically restrain her as she lunged toward the bench, shrieking that she was the victim of a setup and demanding to speak to Judge Judy's supervisor. Her 15 years of terrorizing neighbors had all been projection. She was everything she'd accused others of being, only 1,000 times worse. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, the county sheriff had seized Margaret's house to recover the embezzled HOA funds. The Willowbrook Heights community held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president, with several neighbors describing years of harassment and intimidation they'd been too afraid to report. Margaret faced criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and operating an unlicensed business with potential prison time that could destroy the rest of her life. The woman who'd spent 15 years wielding fake authority over others had been crushed by someone with real legal power in less than 20 minutes. The viral clip of Margaret calling Judge Judy a fake judge became internet legend, spawning countless memes and reaction videos. But the real victory belonged to the Willowbrook Heights community, who finally got justice after 15 years of tyranny. David Martinez not only had his fines dismissed but received compensation for Margaret's seized assets, and the entire neighborhood began the healing process from years of HOA abuse. That's how you deal with an entitled HOA Karen who thinks she's above the law she enforces on others. If you loved watching Judge Judy completely destroy this hypocritical tyrant and deliver perfect justice, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible moments where bullies get exactly what they deserve. Let us know in the comments if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen like Margaret, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when entitled, "People Learn That Real Authority Always Wins Over Fake Power." Thanks for watching, and remember, there's always someone with more real authority than your fake authority, and justice has a way of finding hypocrites who think they're untouchable.